Hi, I'm Andrew Falerka, and this is my thesis presentation of how the microprotection protocols increase drug seizures by the Border Patrol. Here's a brief overview of what we're going to be covering during the presentation. I'll go over my hypotheses, the literature review, the methodologies. I'll then cover the results and conclusions I came to, as well as any recommendations moving forward. So my two hypotheses was one that CBP sees more drugs during the implementation of microprotection protocols, and the second was that the microprotection protocols played a major role in deterring drug trafficking through the seizures by CBP, as well as maintaining a low encounter and apprehension rate at the southern border. And here are just some brief points. We're going to go through each one of these in depth as we go along, but here's the literature review of the thesis and research that I did. So a brief overview of the microprotection protocols. In 2019, then Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, Secretary Nielsen, released a statement regarding the border status, mentioning that there was a free fall and that vulnerable populations were swarming the southern border in an effort to escape their countries to gain asylum here in the United States. This left many detention facilities overcrowded. And to address some of these issues that we were having, President Trump enacted the MPPs, and they were also known as the Remain in Mexico policies. Due to a agreement with Mexico, detainees were allowed to be held in Mexico, which freed up a lot of space in the detention facilities here in the U.S. But in 2020, when President Biden took office, he would terminate this policy. Supreme Court would eventually require him to reenact the policies, but with so much limitations that were placed on the new policy, it's basically not even the same as the one that was enacted back in 2019. So due to the large crowds inside the detention facilities, Border Patrol is forced to care for the detainees and maintain detention facilities, and that has resulted in them not being able to properly patrol their areas and carry on with their normal duties. So let's discuss how the Border Patrol was implementing the MPP at the time. As I mentioned, this policy authorized the DHS to return those seeking asylum to Mexico. It also granted the authority to remove individuals identified by Department of Homeland Security, ICE, and other agencies for removal. However, if there are individuals that were fearful of their return to Mexico or to any other country of their origin, they were able to petition their stay in the U.S. to await for their court proceedings rather than be returned. If this was the case, USCIS was the agency responsible for investigating these matters and were the ultimate deciding factor of whether they continue the MPP process. Regardless, if any alien was granted MPP, they were given a court date and a time. If they were being detained in one of the facilities, ICE ERO was the agency responsible for transportation to and from hearings. They were also responsible for the removals of any aliens that had been deemed removable. For any individuals who were taken back to court, there were biometrics taken. So how has this all affected the border and the drugs coming into the United States? Well, because of the confusion of how to address the issues and concerns at the southern border, where to hold detainees, how to best process them, all of the above has left the border security very weak as agents are now being forced to care for detainees and maintain facilities. They're not doing normal patrols as they normally would. And because of this, TCOs have capitalized on the weak borders and the gaps in between border entry points. This has resulted in minimal drug seizures and high encounter rates. And with the high rise in demand of fentanyl, which is a very dangerous and lethal drug, the criminal organizations, the cartels, have only tried to push the drugs through the southern border even more. So until they can be addressed, this will continue. So to attempt to answer my hypotheses, I wanted to see if there was any correlation between drug seizures and encounters at the southern border. And looking at the data provided by the Border Patrol Drug Statistics Tool and Encounters chart, I was able to do so. There was a trend that was apparent between encounters and seizures, and that was as the encounters increased, the seizure amounts would decrease, and vice versa. So if the encounters decrease, the seizure amounts would increase. So in fiscal year 2019 and 2020, the combined total encounters between those two fiscal years was 1.4 million people. And resulting of that, there was over 500,000 pounds of marijuana seized. I think we go over the total amounts in another slide, so I'll just leave that at that. That was just the largest gap between increases and decrease between the drugs that I selected. And the crazy thing was that in fiscal year 2022 alone, there was already over 2 million encounters at the southern border, which was an extremely big difference as well. But in fiscal year 2021, there was only about 319,000 pounds seized of marijuana during that fiscal year, which kind of shows how the encounters started to increase. We're already starting to see how the seizures started to decrease. And that's it's been argued that Border Patrol agents are too preoccupied with immigration processes to have any effect on the drug smuggling trade. Um, Andrew Arthur of the Center of Immigration Studies was um, one of the ones that argued this point as I was going through the research. So, as I mentioned, I used the data to try to analyze the relation between encounters and seizures at the border, and it was used to try to identify the trends between the years with and without MPP implementation. So now we've come to the results that I found during my research. So the first hypothesis was that the CPP seized more drugs during the MPP. 2019 and 2020 fiscal years would have been the MPP implemented years. And as you can see, they both have very high seizure rates. One at almost 700,000, the other over 700,000. And then 2021 and 2022 fiscal years were the years that were pretty much non-implemented by the MPP, and you see how much lower they go. Fiscal year 2021 almost drops and reduced by half, and even more so in the fiscal year of 2022. And now we've come to the second hypothesis result. It basically said that the return policy played a role in deterring drug trafficking while maintaining a low encounter rate. We have already seen this in the charts as the encounters were high, the seizures were low. And it's the encounters were low, the seizures were very high. Um, the high encounter rates and detentions and apprehensions was due to increased detainment lengths due to lack of agreements with the DHS. These agreements basically just make it easier to electronically verify nationalities from those entering from other countries. Obviously, the process extends longer, which means they have to wait longer for court hearings and to get the process moving along. Processing detainees have affected patrolling procedures as now the Border Patrol agents are caring for the detainees at these detention facilities as well as maintaining the detention facilities to certain standards. This has resulted in fewer encounters and higher seizure amounts in events when they are able to return detainees to Mexico and are able to do their normal patrols in the areas between border entry points. Now, here are my conclusions between my hypotheses. The first hypothesis was definitely fully supported um, through the substantiated data from the government agencies. We were able to determine that the Border Patrol did seize more drugs during the MPP, as the charts show that they were almost doubled um, and even almost tripled. If you look from fiscal year 22 to fiscal year 20, if you compare those two. However, hypothesis 2 was partially supported. Um, it's very possible that drugs were deterred as they were being seized at a higher rate during the MPP. However, there's no way to properly quantify the amount of drugs that were successfully smuggled in, whether it be during the years implemented with NPP or the years without. There's just no way to determine where the drugs came from, even if they've been seized within country. There's no way to prove that they came through the Mexico border or any other border for that matter. And here are my recommendations moving forward. We need to expand agreements with other countries so that DHS can verify nationalities electronically. We've already seen how effective this is to lessen processing times, as we already have agreements with Mexico and some other countries in Northern and Central America. We also need to increase the collaborations with the government of Mexico. A major reason why the NPP was so successful was the agreement between US and Mexico, and the fact that we were able to hold our detainees on the Mexico side of the border and able to free up our resources and personnel to continue their normal duties, patrolling and addressing the smuggling trades. We also need to increase immigration judges. There's already a large backlog of cases, not to mention the present and future cases to come. So it's important to have enough personnel to effectively attack that. I think there was over 1 million cases that were backlogged, and even if they stopped doing any other cases and just did the backlog of cases, it would still take a great amount of time to cover that backlog. So we need to make sure we can take care of that as well as be properly staffed for the future and present cases. We also need to have better access to policies and procedures for those not in DHS agreements. A major issue and reason why many people were detained was because they were unsure and unknowledgeable of the immigration policies and procedures here in the U.S., which require them to be detained a lot longer. If possible, to give them the information before they seek their journey here, it may actually help to quicken the process rather than to have them be detained for so long. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your time.